Rommel did not lose this war on the battlefield. He lost it the moment he understood something no German plan could fix. On a single morning in Tunisia, Rommel watched the impossible happen. Not an attack, not a breakthrough, but a number that should not have existed. American tanks kept arriving, and they did not stop. While German units waited weeks for a handful of replacements, the enemy was receiving more armor in 2 days than Rommel could lose in a month. This was not a failure of command. It was not a failure of courage. It was not even a failure of strategy. It was the collapse of an entire way of fighting wars. Germany was still fighting for ground. America was fighting with factories. From that moment on, every German victory was temporary. Every Allied loss was reversible, and the outcome of the war became a question with only one answer. Rommel did not say a word, because words were no longer necessary. The battlefield had been replaced by shipyards, by assembly lines, by supply depots stretching across an ocean. What Rommel saw that morning was not defeat, it was inevitability. And once you understand why those tanks arrived so fast, you understand why Germany could never win World War II. We go further. If you appreciate deep, serious World War II analysis that goes beyond battles and myths, consider subscribing. This story only gets darker from here. In early 1943, Erwin Rommel was not a defeated commander. He was exhausted. He was frustrated. But he was still respected by his enemies as much as by his own men. For nearly 2 years, Rommel had turned the deserts of North Africa into a proving ground for German military skill. Against larger British forces, he had won again and again through speed, deception, and timing. He outmaneuvered opponents who often had more tanks, more aircraft, and better supply lines, at least on paper. To the outside world, Rommel looked like proof that brilliance could overcome numbers. To many inside Germany, he represented something even more dangerous: hope. Hope that superior leadership could still bend reality. Hope that tactical genius could compensate for strategic weakness. And for a time, that hope seemed justified. Rommel understood maneuver warfare intuitively. He knew how to strike before the enemy was ready, how to exploit hesitation, how to turn limited resources into temporary advantage. His victories at Gazala and Tobruk were not accidents. They were demonstrations of what a skilled commander could do when opponents moved slowly and thought cautiously. But war was changing faster than reputations could keep up. By late 1942, the character of the conflict in North Africa had shifted. The British were no longer alone. The United States had entered the war with resources on a scale the Axis had never faced before. Not just more soldiers, not just more tanks, but a different kind of power altogether. At first, the difference was subtle. American units performed poorly in their early engagements. At Kasserine Pass, German forces inflicted heavy losses on inexperienced U.S. formations. From a purely tactical perspective, it looked like confirmation of German superiority. American commanders made mistakes. American units broke under pressure. German officers took note. But Rommel saw something else beneath the surface. The Americans retreated, and then they returned. And they returned, changed. Losses that would have crippled a German division were replaced in weeks. Equipment destroyed in battle reappeared as if it had never been lost. Units that should have required months to rebuild were back at the front almost immediately. This was not resilience. It was replacement. German doctrine had always assumed that attrition mattered, that losses accumulated, that wear and tear slowly degraded an army's ability to fight. This assumption had shaped every campaign Germany had fought since 1939. It was logical, it was historical, and it was about to become obsolete. Rommel began to understand that the enemy he was facing did not experience loss the same way Germany did. For Germany, every tank destroyed represented a problem. For America, it represented a delay. German equipment was precious, complex, difficult to replace. Every loss tightened constraints elsewhere. A tank sent to Africa was a tank not sent to Russia. A ship loaded for Tunisia was a ship exposed to Allied aircraft and submarines. American equipment, by contrast, came from a system designed for abundance. Factories were not responding to battlefield conditions, they were operating continuously, indifferent to individual victories or defeats. Production schedules did not slow because a battle went badly. They accelerated Rommel still believed battles mattered. He still believed decisions on the ground could influence outcomes. That belief was not foolish. It was professional. It was what his entire career had taught him. What he did not yet fully grasp was that the battlefield was no longer the center of gravity. The real contest was happening far from the desert, in shipyards, rail networks, fuel depots, and assembly lines that stretched across continents and oceans. The Desert War was becoming a downstream effect of decisions made thousands of kilometers away. German command culture struggled to accept this shift. Plans were still written as if operations could be won through willpower and maneuver alone. Reinforcements were promised without regard to delivery capacity. Production figures were cited without accounting for transport losses. Felt the gap widening between what was planned and what was possible. He sent reports. He requested resources. He warned that the arithmetic no longer worked. The responses he received were polite and meaningless. Rommel was still expected to fight as if the system behind him was intact, as if Germany could sustain losses indefinitely, as if the war he was fighting was the same war he had mastered years earlier. It was not. By March 1943, Rommel stood at the edge of a realization that many commanders never reach until it is too late. That skill can no longer compensate for imbalance, and that once a system collapses, no individual brilliance can restore it. He did not yet know the exact numbers. He did not yet know the scale. But he was about to see it arriving on the horizon, one vehicle after another. The thing did not begin with gunfire. There was no barrage, no radio panic, no warning of an imminent attack. It began quietly with dust. From a ridgeline overlooking the coastal plains of southern Tunisia, Rommel watched a pale cloud rise along the horizon. At first, it looked ordinary. Desert traffic always produced dust. Supply columns moved constantly, on both sides. Nothing about it suggested danger. Then the dust did not fade. Minutes passed, then an hour, then another. The column kept coming. Binoculars revealed silhouettes, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, self-propelled guns. They moved steadily, without urgency, without concealment. This was not a force creeping toward battle. It was a force arriving because it could. German intelligence officers began counting. The numbers exceeded expectations almost immediately. Estimates were crossed, then doubled. Vehicles rolled past in a continuous stream, stretching beyond visibility, disappearing northward toward the front. There was no pause for reorganization, no staging area, no sense of preparation. This was not how armies behaved. This was how systems behaved. For weeks, Rommel had waited for reinforcements. Requests had been filed, approved, promised. On paper, the numbers looked reasonable. Replacement tanks were allocated. Supplies were scheduled. Everything appeared under control until it met reality. Ships were delayed. Ports were congested. Convoys were sunk. What arrived at the front bore little resemblance to what had been promised in Berlin. Now, in front of him, the enemy was experiencing the opposite. Losses were irrelevant. Timing was irrelevant. Even geography seemed irrelevant. Vehicles were arriving not because conditions were favorable, but because the system behind them functioned regardless of conditions. This was not superiority achieved through planning. It was superiority produced by scale. Rommel understood combat. He understood logistics. But what he was witnessing did not fit the framework he had been trained to operate within. His entire career had been shaped by scarcity, limited fuel, limited vehicles, limited time. Decisions mattered because resources were finite. Here, finiteness appeared to be absent. The enemy did not wait for success before reinforcing. They reinforced as a default state. For German forces, attrition was cumulative. Each destroyed vehicle tightened constraints elsewhere. Each lost tank reduced future options. Decisions had to be calculated because mistakes could not be erased. For the Americans, attrition was temporary. Losses were absorbed, corrected, overwritten by new deliveries arriving faster than reports could be compiled. Rommel began to grasp the implication, and it was devastating. This was not a battle he could win by maneuver. This was not a situation he could correct with timing or surprise. He was no longer facing an opponent whose strength fluctuated with victories and defeats. He was facing an opponent whose strength increased automatically. The battlefield had become a receiving dock. Every vehicle rolling past represented not just firepower, but confidence, the confidence to move openly, to accept losses, to trade equipment for time without fear of depletion. It meant that mistakes could be tolerated, delays could be absorbed, failures could be corrected. German command culture had never allowed such luxury. The implications spread outward in Rommel's mind. If tanks arrived like this, then ammunition would follow, fuel would follow, spare parts would follow. And once that chain was established, there would be no natural limit. The desert, once an equalizer, had lost its power. Distance no longer favored the defender. Scarcity no longer punished aggression. What Rommel was seeing was not a surge, it was a baseline. This was the minimum level of force the enemy could sustain, not the maximum, and that realization carried a second, more uncomfortable truth. If this was what America could deliver to a secondary theater, thousands of kilometers from home, then the true weight of its power had not yet been applied. North Africa was not the center of gravity. It was a demonstration. Rommel had spent his career exploiting hesitation. Here, there was none. He had relied on the enemy making mistakes under pressure. Here, pressure meant nothing. The film eventually ended not because it had reached a limit, but because the road had delivered what was scheduled to arrive. The flow ceased as predictably as it had begun. There was no celebration, no reaction from Rommel's staff. What was there to say? No order could stop what had already happened. No counterattack could reverse a process that did not depend on success. The numbers spoke clearly enough. This was not the loss of a position. It was the loss of relevance. Rommel had not yet lost North Africa. That would come later. What he lost that morning was the belief that victory could still be shaped at the front. From this point forward, every engagement would be fought inside boundaries he could not change. And the war he thought he was fighting, the war of decisions, timing, and skill, was already over. What Rommel had witnessed was not an anomaly. It was not the result of clever deception or a temporary surge. It was the visible edge of a system operating exactly as designed. To understand why the numbers shattered German strategy, Rommel had to confront a truth that military theory had avoided for generations. Modern war was no longer governed primarily by battlefield decisions. It was governed by industrial processes. Germany did not lack tanks because its engineers were incompetent. German armored design was, in many ways, superior. German tanks were powerful, heavily armored, technologically advanced. On paper, they outmatched their American counterparts. But paper did not move across deserts. German production emphasized perfection over repetition. Each new model promised improved performance, thicker armor, stronger guns. The result was a fleet of machines that were impressive individually and disastrous collectively. Every model required different spare parts, different training, different maintenance procedures. A breakdown did not mean a quick repair. It meant waiting. Waiting for parts, waiting for specialists, waiting for transport that might never arrive. American tanks were different. They were not elegant, they were not exceptional, they were standardized. American industrial planning assumed failure as a constant. Vehicles would break, crews would make mistakes, equipment would be destroyed. The system was designed not to prevent loss, but to erase its consequences. Factories did not pause to redesign. They repeated. Supply chains did not adapt slowly. They overwhelmed. A damaged German was not a strategic loss. It was an inconvenience. This difference extended far beyond tanks. German logistics functioned as a fragile chain. Each link depended on the previous one. Production depended on scarce raw materials. Transport depended on vulnerable shipping routes. Delivery depended on ports already operating beyond capacity. Break one link, and everything downstream collapsed. Allied air power and naval interdiction targeted precisely those links. Ships were sunk, ports were bombed, rail lines were disrupted. Every successful attack multiplied its effect across the entire system. America's logistics functioned as a network. Multiple ports, multiple routes, redundant capacity. No single failure mattered. Losses were absorbed, rerouted, replaced. The system degraded slowly, if at all. Even when attacked, it continued to function at levels Germany could not reach under ideal conditions. Fuel illustrated the imbalance most clearly. Germany entered the war without secure access to large oil reserves. Every operation depended on constrained supplies, synthetic fuel production, and vulnerable imports. Fuel was rationed, training was reduced. Maneuver was limited not by enemy action, but by scarcity. American forces operated without such constraints. Fuel did not determine whether operations could occur. It determined only how aggressively they would be conducted. Training continued uninterrupted. Units maneuvered freely. Mistakes were corrected through repetition, not punished through immobilization. Time itself behaved differently inside these systems. For Germany, time worked against survival. Delays accumulated. Shortages compounded. Every postponed delivery increased future risk. For America, time worked in its favor. Every week increased available strength. Every delay favored the side whose baseline capacity was higher. Rommel began to understand that he was no longer facing an enemy that could be pressured into collapse. He was facing an enemy that improved under pressure. Even defeat became instructional. When American units failed, they returned stronger. When German units failed, they returned weaker if they returned at all. The difference was not morale, it was architecture. German military culture emphasized initiative, improvisation, individual brilliance. These traits had delivered spectacular early victories, but they assumed a supporting system capable of sustaining risk. That system no longer existed. Requests for reinforcements passed through layers of bureaucracy that operated on assumptions already obsolete. Production figures were quoted without accounting for transportation losses. Promises were made without reference to delivery capacity. Reports increasingly focused on arithmetic rather than tactics. How many tanks arrived? How many were operational? How many could be replaced? The answers grew more alarming with each passing month. He recognized that no adjustment at the front could compensate for deficits accumulating behind it. Even perfect defense could only slow the inevitable. Every successful action merely delayed the moment when numbers overwhelmed skill. The system was not failing accidentally. It was failing predictably. Germany was attempting to fight a multi-front industrial war with an economy optimized for short, decisive campaigns. Its enemies were fighting a long war of production, attrition, and replacement, and they had planned for it. Rommel's realization carried a final, unsettling implication. If this imbalance existed in North Africa, then it existed everywhere. Tunisia was not unique. It was simply where the mathematics became impossible to ignore. The war's outcome was not being decided by who maneuvered better this week or held a ridge tomorrow. It was being decided by which side could turn raw materials into combat power faster and sustain that process indefinitely. On the battlefield, Rommel still commanded troops. But the war had moved beyond his reach. Strategy had been overtaken by throughput, command by capacity. What he faced was not defeat in the traditional sense. It was obsolescence. And once a system becomes obsolete, there is no counterattack that can restore it. There is only delay. Rommel understood the system. A more disturbing realization followed. Germany was not losing because it was temporarily behind. Germany was losing because it could never catch up. The gap was not tactical. It was structural. Every solution proposed by German planners assumed time to regroup, time to rebuild, time to restore balance. But time itself had become asymmetric. For Germany, time drained strength. For the enemy, time generated it. German production operated near its ceiling. Factories were already running at maximum capacity. Labor was fully mobilized. Raw materials were rationed. Any increase in one area required a cut somewhere else. There was no reserve left to tap. American production, by contrast, was still accelerating. New factories were coming online. Output increased month after month without forcing trade-offs between theaters. The system expanded even as it supplied active fronts. This meant that Germany could not recover losses, even if it stopped fighting everywhere else. Rommel understood what this implied. A tank lost in Africa was not simply replaced by a tank from Germany. That replacement competed with every other front, Russia, Italy, France. Reinforcing one theater weakened another. Every decision created new vulnerabilities. The enemy faced no such dilemma. Replacements did not come from redistribution. They came from growth. Even if German units performed flawlessly, the arithmetic remained unforgiving. Attrition favored the side whose replacement rate exceeded its loss rate. Germany's loss rate exceeded its replacement rate everywhere. That equation never reversed. Attempts to compensate focused on quality. German engineers designed heavier armor, more powerful guns, more sophisticated machines. Each new model promised to restore balance through superiority. Instead, complexity deepened the crisis. Advanced machines required specialized maintenance. Specialized maintenance required trained personnel. Trained personnel required time and fuel both in short supply. Breakdowns removed vehicles from combat for weeks rather than hours. The enemy chose the opposite path. American vehicles were deliberately simplified. Reliability mattered more than perfection. Components were standardized. Repairs were expected to occur close to the front with basic tools. If a vehicle could be fixed quickly, it returned to combat. If not, it was replaced. The system assumed loss and minimized its impact. German planners still believed that innovation could offset volume. Rommel knew better. Innovation could not outrun logistics. Every improvement increased dependence on a supply chain already stretched to breaking. Fuel shortages exposed the impossibility most clearly. German units rationed movement. Training was curtailed. Maneuvers were postponed. Tactical opportunities passed unused because fuel could not be spared. The enemy operated without such restraint. Movement was not a decision weighed against scarcity. It was routine. Units trained constantly. Losses were accepted because they could be corrected. Operational tempo increased while German tempo slowed. This created a second-order effect even more damaging than numbers. Confidence. Allied forces attacked knowing they would be supported tomorrow. German forces defended knowing tomorrow would be worse than today. Morale eroded not from fear, but from inevitability. Rommel saw it in his officers. Decisions became cautious, not because of lack of courage, but because resources could not be risked. Initiative declined. Flexibility narrowed. The freedom of action that had defined early German victories disappeared. Meanwhile, the enemy grew bolder. Mistakes did not cripple them. They educated them. Failures were analyzed, corrected, and absorbed into a system that grew stronger with each iteration. Germany could not learn at the same speed. Each lesson cost irreplaceable assets. Each experiment risked collapse. Rommel's correspondence reflected this shift. His focus moved away from tactical recommendations and toward warnings about sustainability. He argued not for bold offensives, but for strategic realism. His message was consistent. The war could not be won by adjusting plans. It could only be lost more slowly. Higher command resisted this conclusion. Plans continued to assume that effort alone could close the gap. Reinforcements were promised without regard to shipping capacity. New weapons were cited as future solutions without accounting for production limits. Rommel recognized the pattern. Hope replaced analysis. Ideology replaced arithmetic. Germany was not planning how to win. It was planning how to endure. Endurance, however, favored the side that grew stronger over time. Even if Germany achieved local success, the system would erase it. Gains would be temporary. Losses, permanent. Momentum flowed in only one direction. Rommel understood that the war had entered a phase where outcomes were determined before battles were fought. Decisions at the front influenced timing, not destiny. The realization stripped command of its former meaning. He could still deploy units. He could still delay advances. He could still impose costs, but he could no longer shape the future. Germany had reached the point where strategy was no longer about choosing paths, only about choosing which consequences to face first. The system had closed, and once a system closes, no brilliance can force it open again. Spring of 1943. Rommel no longer thought in terms of victory. That change did not happen suddenly. It emerged gradually, as each report confirmed what the numbers had already implied. What was unfolding in North Africa was not a temporary setback. It was the visible beginning of an irreversible process. Rommel was still expected to fight. Orders from higher command made that clear. His mission was no longer to defeat the enemy, but to delay them, to consume Allied time, to force them to commit resources, to postpone the next phase of the war. Tunisia was no longer a battlefield meant to be won. It was a holding action. Time, however, had ceased to be neutral. Every week that passed weakened German forces and strengthened Allied ones. Even when the front held, the balance shifted. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Ammunition stocks declined. Fuel allocations tightened. Units remained on paper that no longer existed in practice. Rommel understood that delaying the enemy no longer bought opportunity. It bought inevitability. The strategic logic behind North Africa revealed the wider truth of the war. Germany was now fighting everywhere at once and sustaining nowhere fully. Every theater competed for the same limited pool of resources. Every reinforcement required another front to be neglected. The enemy faced no such constraints. American forces in North Africa were not consuming resources meant for another campaign. They were the product of an industrial system capable of supporting multiple theaters simultaneously. Tunisia did not weaken the Allied position elsewhere. It strengthened it. This meant that the war's outcome was no longer contingent on any single campaign. North Africa did not decide the war. It exposed its trajectory. Rommel began to see Tunisia as a preview, not of defeat, but of repetition. What was happening there would happen again, wherever Allied logistics could establish themselves. If the Allies reached Italy, the same pattern would unfold. If they landed in France, the same arithmetic would apply. The battlefield no longer determined success, supply lines did. This realization stripped strategy of its former drama. War ceased to be a contest of bold decisions and became a process of accumulation. Every convoy added weight. Every factory shift added pressure. Every week without interruption increased disparity. Rommel's later reports reflected this shift in thinking. He no longer argued for maneuvers designed to change the situation. He argued for withdrawals designed to preserve what little remained. His language became clinical, factual, devoid of optimism. He was not surrendering. He was calculating. Higher command interpreted this realism as pessimism. Rommel was accused of lacking resolve, of seeing obstacles where determination could overcome them. But Rommel knew determination did not manufacture fuel. Resolve did not build ships. Courage did not create spare parts. He was not questioning the ability of German soldiers. He was questioning the conditions under which they were being sacrificed. By the time Allied forces broke through the remaining defenses in Tunisia, the outcome had long been clear. German and Italian units fought professionally, withdrawing in stages, delaying where possible. They inflicted losses. They bought days and weeks. They could not buy reversal. When the final surrender came, it confirmed what Rommel had already understood. Hundreds of thousands of men entered captivity. Equipment losses were total. The Axis presence in North Africa ceased to exist, not because of collapse in morale, not because of tactical defeat, but because the system supporting them had been exhausted beyond recovery. Rommel was no longer present when it ended. He had been recalled to Germany officially for health reasons, unofficially because his assessments had become too uncomfortable. He had spoken the truth too clearly, too early. Yet the lessons he carried with him did not remain in Africa. They followed him north. When Rommel later assessed the defense of Western Europe, his conclusions were shaped by Tunisia. He no longer believed in fighting wars of maneuver against an enemy with unlimited replacement capacity. He understood that once Allied logistics reached the continent, resistance would become a matter of delay, not denial. Or, in his mind, had already been decided. What remained was timing. This perspective separated Rommel from many of his contemporaries. Some continued to believe that a decisive battle could still change everything, that a new weapon, a new doctrine, a single bold stroke could reverse the imbalance. Rommel no longer shared that belief. He had seen what a modern industrial system looked like when it touched the battlefield. He understood that courage and skill could still matter, but only within boundaries set far beyond the front. North Africa was where those boundaries became visible. It was where the war revealed its true nature, not as a struggle between armies, but as a contest between systems. One system expanded under pressure. The other collapsed. From that point forward, every German operation was constrained by the same reality. Battles could still be fought. Losses could still be inflicted. But the direction of the war no longer changed. The outcome had been decided long before the final shots were fired. It had been decided when production replaced improvisation, when logistics replaced leadership, and when mathematics replaced hope. What happened in North Africa did not stay in North Africa. For Rommel, Tunisia was not an isolated disaster. It was a warning, one that would return, amplified, on a much larger stage. When he left Africa, Rommel carried with him a conclusion that few German commanders were willing to accept. Once Allied logistics were allowed to function on the continent, the war would become unwinnable. The question was no longer if the Allies would invade Western Europe. It was where and whether Germany could stop them before the system activated. By late 1943, Rommel was assigned to defend the Atlantic coast from the Netherlands to the Loire River. His responsibility was not maneuver warfare in open desert, but static defense against an invasion backed by overwhelming material power. And immediately, he saw the same pattern forming. Allied air power dominated the skies. Movement during daylight was increasingly suicidal. Rail lines were under constant attack. Fuel shortages limited German mobility even in rear areas. Training suffered. Coordination degraded. The conditions were different from Africa. The logic was identical. Rommel understood that once Allied forces landed and established supply depots, ports, and airfields, the situation would mirror Tunisia, but on a continental scale. The same flow of material that had overwhelmed German forces in North Africa would now pour into France. There would be no second chance. This led Rommel to a conclusion that placed him at odds with German high command. The decisive battle could not be fought inland. It had to be fought at the beaches. Rommel argued that armor must be positioned close to the coast. Obstacles must be placed directly in the landing zones. Mines, barriers, and fortifications had to delay the enemy in the first hours before logistics could take hold. If the Allies were allowed to land freely, to unload supplies, to bring their system ashore, Germany would lose the same way it had lost in Africa. Slowly, mathematically, irreversibly. Other commanders disagreed. They believed in counterattacks, in holding armor back as a mobile reserve, in striking once the enemy's intentions were clear. This approach relied on maneuver, on movement, timing, and operational flexibility. Rommel knew those assumptions were outdated. Movement required fuel. Fuel was scarce. Counterattacks required daylight coordination. Daylight belonged to Allied aircraft. Timing required freedom of action. Freedom no longer existed. Rommel's position was not defeatist. It was informed by experience. He had seen what happened when an enemy with unlimited replacement capacity was allowed to stabilize. Once that occurred, resistance became symbolic. The debate was never resolved. When the invasion came on the 6th of June, 1944, Rommel was not present at his headquarters. Weather reports had suggested an attack was unlikely. Even Rommel could not escape the friction of uncertainty. By the time he returned, Allied forces had established multiple beachheads. Supplies were already flowing. Vehicles were already unloading. Airfields were already under construction. The system had landed. Within days, the same pattern Rommel had observed in Tunisia began to repeat. Allied strength increased daily. German counterattacks were piecemeal, under-resourced. Exposed to air attack, losses could not be replaced. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. The front stabilized not because Germany had succeeded, but because Allied logistics had. From that moment on, the war in Western Europe followed the same logic as North Africa. German forces fought skillfully, inflicted losses, delayed advances, but delay no longer altered direction. Rommel's fears were confirmed. Once the Allied system was ashore, it could not be dislodged. The beaches of Normandy became supply ports. Temporary roads became permanent arteries. What began as an invasion became a production line feeding the front. For every German tank destroyed, several more arrived for the Allies. For every German gun silenced, dozens continued firing. The war was no longer being fought between armies. It was being fought between capacities. Rommel was wounded shortly after, removed from command, and eventually implicated in a plot against Hitler. His life ended before the war did, but the pattern he had identified continued to unfold exactly as he had predicted. He fought on for another year. Cities were destroyed. Millions died. But nothing altered the fundamental imbalance that had revealed itself in Tunisia. The lesson repeated not because it was ignored, but because it could not be escaped. Once industrial war replaced maneuver war, only one outcome was possible. Skill could delay it, courage could endure it, leadership could soften its edges, but none of them could stop it. Rommel had learned that lesson early, standing in the desert, watching a convoy that should not have existed. Europe would learn it later. Historians describe how Germany lost the Second World War. They often begin with battles: Stalingrad, El Alamein, Normandy. They analyze maneuvers, decisions, personalities. They debate mistakes and missed opportunities. They search for the moment when the tide turned. But the tide had already turned long before most people noticed. What Rommel understood standing in the Tunisian desert was that the war had crossed a threshold. Once crossed, no single battle could reverse it. World War II stopped being a contest between armies and became a contest between systems. One system was built for speed, improvisation, and early victory. The other was built for scale, repetition, and endurance. The first could win battles. The second could win wars. Germany entered the war believing that superior leadership, discipline, and tactical brilliance would compensate for material disadvantage. For a time, that belief seemed justified. Blitzkrieg shattered opponents who were unprepared for its speed. Early victories reinforced the illusion that skill could overcome scarcity. But modern war does not reward elegance. It rewards throughput, the ability to replace losses faster than they occur, the ability to absorb failure without collapse, the ability to treat destruction as a temporary condition. That was the advantage the Allies possessed and Germany did not. By 1943, the gap was no longer hidden. It could be measured, it could be counted, it could be watched, vehicle by vehicle, rolling toward the front. Rommel's silence in Tunisia was not resignation. It was recognition. Recognition that courage could still matter, but only inside limits imposed by logistics. Recognition that leadership could still inspire, but not manufacture fuel. Recognition that tactics could still delay, but not reverse arithmetic. The tragedy was not that Germany lacked capable commanders. It was that those commanders were fighting a war that no longer existed. Factories had replaced headquarters as the true centers of power. Shipping schedules mattered more than orders. Standardization mattered more than innovation. The Allies did not need to be better at war. They needed to be better at sustaining it. And they were. The lesson of Tunisia echoed across every front that followed. In Italy, in France, in the skies over Germany, each campaign confirmed the same reality. Once the Allied system engaged fully, resistance became a question of duration, not outcome. Germany fought on, not because victory was possible, but because surrender was unthinkable. The war ended not with a decisive maneuver, but with exhaustion. With factories still producing, supply lines still flowing, and one side no longer able to continue. Rommel did not live to see the end, but his understanding outlived him. It survived in reports, in assessments, in quiet conclusions, ignored by those who still believed in miracles. History remembers generals for the battles they won or lost, but World War II was decided by something less dramatic and more powerful. It was decided by who could turn steel, oil, and labor into combat power continuously, predictably, and without interruption. The tanks Rommel watched arrive in Tunisia were not extraordinary. They were routine, and that was the most terrifying realization of all. Because once war becomes routine for one side, the other has already lost. This documentary changed how you think about World War II. There are more stories waiting on this channel. Stories about the systems that shaped history. Subscribe, and we'll continue uncovering them.